There was a punishment so brutal, so methodical, that executioners were trained to keep the condemned alive through it, not to end suffering, but to extend it. It wasn't a quick death. It wasn't even close. The wheel wasn't just a tool. It was a message, a public spectacle designed to make the crowd feel something. Fear, maybe. Or worse, relief that it wasn't them up there. Bones broke in a specific order. There was a reason for that, and the person strapped to that wheel? They could stay conscious for hours. What kind of society builds a machine just to make dying take longer? Europe, late medieval period, a time when the law wasn't just about punishment, it was about performance. Courts didn't just want criminals dealt with, they wanted the public to see it happen. Justice, back then, had an audience, and that audience was expected to show up. The breaking wheel existed inside that world. It wasn't invented by some sadistic madman working alone in a dungeon. It came from a legal system, a structured, functioning society that debated, documented, and approved its use. That's the part that doesn't sit right. France had it codified in law by the 13th century. Germany used it well into the 18th century. It crossed borders, adapted to local customs, and got refined over generations. Different regions developed their own variations. Some started from the feet up, others from the chest first. There were actual debates among officials about the most correct way to apply it. Think about that for a second. Committees, discussions, paperwork about how to break a human body most effectively. The condemned were usually brought out in the morning. Markets would pause, families would gather. Children were sometimes brought along, not because parents were cruel, but because witnessing an execution was considered a civic lesson, a reminder of what the law could do. And at the center of all of it was a wooden wheel, large, heavy, mounted on a post or laid flat on a scaffold. Simple looking, almost ordinary. That contrast, ordinary object, extraordinary horror, is exactly what made it work. The process had steps. That's what made it different from other executions of the era. It wasn't chaos. It was a sequence. First, the condemned was tied down, spread across the wheel, or sometimes flat on the ground, with limbs stretched over wooden beams placed underneath. The positioning wasn't random. It was designed to expose the bones. Then the executioner went to work. A heavy iron-edged wheel, or sometimes a hammer or iron bar, came down on the limbs first. Legs, arms, the larger bones. Not the chest, not the spine, not yet. The idea was to keep the person breathing, keep them present for what came next. And here's where it gets into territory that's hard to process. Executioners were skilled, practiced. There are historical records of them being paid more for difficult cases where the condemned had to last longer, because some sentences specified several blows, others specified hours. The crowd watched all of it. In France, some condemned were granted retentum, a mercy clause often pushed for by the church that allowed strangulation before or during the process. A quiet acknowledgement that even the law had a limit, sometimes, but not always. And the wheel wasn't just used on murderers, thieves, heretics, political enemies. The threshold for who ended up on it shifted depending on who was in power. That's the detail that changes everything. It wasn't just about crime, it was about control, and who got to decide what deserved this kind of ending. Here's where the story reaches its darkest point. There are documented cases, not rumors, actual court records, where the breaking wheel was applied and the condemned survived long enough to speak, to look at the crowd, to still be recognizably human while their body had been destroyed beneath them. Some were left on the wheel after, displayed, elevated on a post at a crossroads or city entrance so travelers would pass underneath. The body, sometimes still alive, became part of the landscape. A warning is built into the architecture of daily life. One case from 18th century Germany involved a man left on the wheel for 2 days before death came. 2 days. Guards were posted nearby, not to help, but to prevent anyone from ending it early, because mercy, in that context, was itself a crime. The church sometimes intervened. Priests would approach the wheel and perform last rites while the condemned was still breathing. That image, a man of God administering death rites to someone not yet dead, captures something deeply broken about how that era understood justice, mercy, and punishment all at once. But what's most disturbing isn't the pain. Pain existed everywhere in that world. It's the documentation. Officials recorded these executions with the same tone used for tax collection. Names, dates, offenses, number of blows, and duration. Bureaucratic language wrapped around something almost incomprehensible. One record from France describes a condemned man's reaction to each stage, not with sympathy, but as confirmation that the procedure was being followed correctly. The system wasn't malfunctioning, it was working exactly as designed, and that's the moment the horror shifts, from the wheel itself to the people who built the paperwork around it. The breaking wheel disappeared from European law by the early 19th century. Napoleon's legal reforms pushed it out of France. Other countries followed. But it didn't disappear because societies suddenly developed a conscience. It disappeared because public executions were becoming inconvenient. Crowds were getting harder to control. Enlightenment thinkers were asking uncomfortable questions about what punishment was actually for. The wheel didn't end because it was wrong. It ended because it was no longer useful. That distinction matters. Because the impulse behind it, using pain as a public message, making suffering into spectacle, building systems that process human beings with bureaucratic detachment, that didn't vanish with the wheel. It just changed shape. Every era has its version of institutionalized cruelty dressed in legal language. Every generation inherits some form of it and calls it justice. The medieval court officials who signed off on wheel executions weren't monsters in the way we need them to be. They were administrators, they had families, they went home after. That's the echo that doesn't fade.